Okay, we can go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone so much for joining today. This is the last of a series of webinars we've been putting on this week to discuss some new funding opportunities that CSPI is offering. So today we're going to be talking about school foods. And before we get started, I'm just going to go over a few logistics for the webinar today. We'll ask if you please introduce yourself via the chat. So if you add your name and the organization, maybe the state or city that your organization's focused on in the chat, that'd be great so we can see who all is here. Please keep your microphone on mute during the presentation. My name's Noelle Battle. I'm the grants manager at CSPI, and my colleague Megan Maroney will be co-presenting with me, and our presentation will probably only be about 20 or 30 minutes, and so there'll be plenty of time for Q&A after the session. And we will, to try to facilitate the Q&A, if there's a lot, we ask that people put questions in the chat, and we'll just go through and ask each of those. If there's not a lot of questions, then folks can feel free to unmute and ask your question verbally. So just to start with a little background on CSPI, organizations and folks might be joining today with varying degrees of familiarity with our organization. CSPI is a consumer advocacy organization that's been the leading independent authority on nutrition issues since 1971. We work through advocacy, policy, education, and litigation to make it easier for all Americans to eat healthfully. And a few areas that we like to highlight that we've been involved in leading are passing laws to secure the original nutrition facts labels on packaged foods in the 90s, adding labels for trans fat, added sugars, and major allergens, menu labeling in chain restaurants, supermarkets, and theaters nationwide, removing soda and junk food from schools and improving school meals, and reducing junk food marketing to kids. And a background on the specific opportunity. So we've been awarded a grant from Bloomberg Philanthropies to lead a national advocacy initiative to secure state and local food and nutrition policies that improve public health and provide models that can be replicated and scaled. So as a part of this initiative, we're soliciting applications for across 4 different campaigns currently, of which we'll be focusing on school foods today. And our goal is to support public health for all and address health inequities that unjustly affect low-income families and communities of color. So as I stated before, our campaign opportunity of focus today is ensuring healthy, equitable school meals for all students. We also have opportunities focused on nutritional improvements to SNAP, healthy, equitable kids meals at restaurants, and restaurant menu disclosures. And we did have webinars on each of those topics earlier this week that are now posted on our website if you're interested in those campaigns as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Megan to walk through specifics about the campaign.
Thanks, Noelle. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. So in order to explain our school foods campaign priorities, we think it's important to first walk through some of the background of school nutrition standards, because a lot has been going on over the last few years, especially the last year. So school nutrition standards are particularly important for protecting the health of low-income kids. 73% of students that participate in school lunch and 85% of kids that participate in school breakfast are considered low income. Strong school nutrition standards are important for low-income students because they help reduce the gap in healthy food access between children attending higher and lower income schools. They reduce stigma, and they decrease obesity among low-income students. A study published this summer in Health Affairs, oh, sorry, Noelle, can you go back? A study published this summer in Health Affairs found that the risk of obesity declined substantially each year after the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act implementation, translating to a 47% reduction in obesity prevalence in 2018 from what would have been expected without the legislation. And now more than ever, with millions of families struggling to put food on the table as a result of the coronavirus and resulting economic downturn, school meals are critical to the health of children. Next slide, please. Nutrition standards developed as a result of the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act were finalized in 2012. Once schools began implementing the new nutrition standards, school meals started to look a lot different. The School Nutrition and Meal Cost Study found that the mean Healthy Eating Index score, which measures meeting the dietary guidelines for Americans, increased significantly for school breakfasts and lunches. According to USDA, more than 99% of participating schools were making progress towards serving healthier meals with less sodium, more whole grains, fruits and vegetables, no trans fat, and fewer sugary drinks and unhealthy snack foods. And contrary to claims that we often hear about plate waste and reduced participation, the School Nutrition and Meal Cost Study found that the same amount of plate waste occurred after the updated standards as compared to findings from prior plate waste studies. And school meal participation was highest in schools that had the healthiest meals. Next slide. Despite the success of the updated nutrition standards, in 2017, in one of his first actions in office, USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue signed a proclamation to make school meals great again. In November 2017, USDA released an interim final rule that proposed delaying the next level of sodium reduction, which was Target 2, by 3 years from school year 2017-2018 to school year 2021-2022, and continuing the whole grain rich waivers. At this time, schools were required to serve 100% whole grain rich grains, but they could apply for product specific waivers to offer enriched grains instead of whole grain rich. Prior to the proposed rule in 2017, the waivers were set to expire and all schools would have been meeting the 100% requirement. Lastly, the proposed rule would allow flavored 1% milk to be sold. Next slide. Then in December 2018, USDA released a final rule that looked very different from the proposed rule. The final rule pushed the second sodium reduction target to school year 2024-2025, and it abandoned the final sodium reduction target, which was Target 3. It also halved the whole grain rich requirement from 100 to 50% of grains in place of the waivers. Schools no longer need to apply for a waiver to serve white flour grain products. In April 2019, CSPI and Healthy School Food Maryland sued the USDA in a federal court in Maryland and argued, among other things, that the USDA violated the Administrative Procedures Act by not providing proper notice and comment on its plans to eliminate Target 3 and weaken the whole grain rich requirement. In April of 2020, the court agreed with CSPI that USDA violated the law with their 2018 final rule. Specifically, the court agreed that USDA's final rule is not a logical outgrowth of the interim final rule, and the court's decision ultimately vacated the rule, meaning that the 2012 standards were now in effect. But the sodium reduction timetable established in 2012 is outdated now and needs to be revised by USDA since schools have not been required to be working on sodium reduction since 2018. Next slide. And then just last week, USDA published a proposed rule that reinstates these rollbacks, fixing their procedural defect. There is a 30-day comment period, and then we expect them to promulgate a new rule fairly quickly. Oh, sorry, you can click through. I don't know what the animation, thank you. There's one more probably. On January 23rd, 2020, USDA proposed a rule that would further roll back nutrition standards in school meals. The 2020 proposed rule reduces the amount of fruit that must be offered in breakfast in the classroom from 1 cup to a half a cup. The rule also reduces the required amount of red, orange, and other vegetables served. This is counter to recommendations in the DGAs, which were the basis of the vegetable subgroups created in the school lunch requirements in 2012. The rule widens a loophole by allowing meal items to be served a la carte without meeting the competitive food standards by an additional day. Currently, entrees that are part of the school meal can be served a la carte and exempt from the competitive food standards the day the meal is served and the day after. The proposed rule widens this loophole by extending the exemption by an additional day and seeks comment on exempting side dishes. Next slide. The rule changes the 3-year administrative review cycle to a 5-year cycle with follow-up reviews of high-risk school food authorities only. And lastly, the rule allows schools with SFAs serving fewer than 2,500 students to use 1 or 2 meal patterns to plan meals for students in all grades. So for example, a district with K through 12 could use the same meal plan for grades 6 through 8 for all of their students. This could impact about 23% of all schools. Next slide. Relevant to this sequence of events is, of course, the coronavirus for operators. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act requires that schools be allowed to obtain waivers from school meal patterns based on COVID-19 disruptions to the food supply chain. These waivers are currently allowed until June 30th, 2021. So technically, although schools under normal circumstances would be required to meet the 2012 standards, they're able to waive meal pattern requirements until June of next year because of the pandemic. Next slide. And then in addition to nutrition standards, access to school meals is critical to ensuring the health of kids. In July, House Education and Labor Committee Chairman Bobby Scott introduced the Pandemic Child Hunger Prevention Act. The bill sought to provide free meals for all students for school year 2020-2021. CSPI advocated for this bill in the House by leading a co-sponsor drive and collected stories like the ones that you see here from stakeholders on why they support universal meals. Next slide, please. So this finally brings us to the priorities for the campaign. On this slide, we've listed components that must be addressed for an application to be considered. We'll be able to provide model policy for applicants to work from and have advocacy resources and an upcoming toolkit that will be available. So the first requirement is that the campaign must actually seek to secure a policy, including, for example, a bill, executive order, school board policy, etc. So voluntary or programmatic initiatives are not eligible. The first thing that the policy must address is meal patterns and quality and quantities. A policy must require at a minimum the nutrition standards and meal patterns, including food components and quantities established in the 2012 school meals final rule. This is to prevent against those 2020 proposed rollbacks that I mentioned. The next one is competitive foods. It needs to require at a minimum the 2016 National Competitive Food Standards, Smart Snacks, the National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program, nutrition standards for all foods sold in school. This is again to protect against any future rollbacks that could be issued at the federal level. For sodium, the policy must reinstate the tiered sodium reduction targets, so that's up to target 3, within a feasible timetable, and also include a target 4 for school meals that is consistent with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's dietary reference intakes for sodium, which were issued in March 2019. So at the time of, when the 3 sodium targets were put into place, the recommendations were different for sodium consumption for children, but as of 2019, the most updated science actually lowers the amount that is considered safe for children, which is why we want to see this target 4. For whole grains, we want to have a policy establish a timetable for all grains offered to be whole grain rich, which is 51% whole grain. This rule would be consistent with the 2012 school meals rule before the rollbacks. And then lastly, added sugars. We would like to establish an added sugar limit for school meals and competitive foods that are in alignment with the most recent dietary guidelines for Americans, and also strongly encourage barring the use of unsafe non-nutritive sweeteners. Next slide. Applicants are also strongly encouraged to address universal free meals and engage legislators on child nutrition reauthorization. Activities may include sending action alerts, placing an op-ed or letter to the editor in strategic publications, or participating in Grass Tops meetings. Next slide, please. And then we also encourage but don't require policies to address these additional pieces. So increased reimbursement and technical assistance on nutrition standards, seat time and mealtime requirements, so ensuring that children have sufficient time to eat and that their lunch periods are at reasonable times of the day, eliminating artificial food dyes that are shown to cause adverse behavioral effects in children, funding for kitchen equipment, and aligning summer meal standards with the strong standards that are currently required for school breakfast and school lunch during the actual school year. So I'm going to now turn it back to Noelle.
Great, thanks very much. So just to cover a few more things before we move into the Q&A, in addition to the specific school meal requirements for the campaign, we have some key areas that we've outlined that would contribute to a strong application in our evaluation process. We're looking for applications that have a strong component focused on community engagement, field organizing, and grass tops engagement, that incorporate a strong focus on equity in all aspects of the campaign. We're looking for applications from diverse organizations who are either themselves representative of the population for which a policy is focused, or directly partnering with individuals or community-based organizations representing the populations in the school districts in the state. And then including a robust media and public communications plan, discussing in your application potential obstacles to achieving goals, obstacles around timing or other pushback from stakeholders, and strategies to mitigate those. And finally, if you've already identified possible policy champions within state and local government, that's helpful as well. So we also plan on providing resources to our grantees, and we really see the opportunity to give these grants as building partnerships with new organizations. So these are just a few of the areas where we see ourselves as being able to provide additional assistance to grantees. As Megan mentioned, we have specific toolkits that are being developed for school meals. We've done national messaging research and developing communications materials. We may even be able to do some of our own digital engagement and paid media to support campaigns in different states. We can provide technical assistance on policy and science to support and providing testimony, writing op-eds, things like that. Also support on the grassroots organizing side and coalition building, as well as support for state and local lobbying. So the next steps here, we will circulate, if there's any questions that come up today that require follow-up that we don't have initial answers to, we will follow up with those. We will be providing a copy of the slides, and a lot of this information is in the documents that are on the RFP, but we're happy to share a PDF of the slides as well. And my colleague Katie will be sending that out in the next few days. We're asking for applications to be submitted by the end of the year, and definitely encourage anyone to follow up with questions. If you have an idea for a specific campaign, but you have questions about particular aspects of it, feel free to reach out, or if you have questions about the application process and some of the components that we're asking for, we can try to answer questions on that as well. In particular, we are in this current funding cycle we're looking at grants right now that'll be approximately 1 year, starting in February of 2021, running through the end of January 2022. We realize that there are legislative timelines, and sometimes a lot of support needs to be built to pass policies. So we want applicants to be realistic about what they would plan on accomplishing within the next year. And then we will potentially have future funding cycles in the future. And so here's our contact information. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to my colleague Katie, who is going to manage the Q&A. I think I see we've gotten some questions already in the chat.
Yes, thank you both. And I can go ahead and start with the Q&A. So one question that we've gotten is, are you providing guidance on what might constitute a feasible timetable, or can the bill direct our state agency to come up with a timetable?
Sure. So we are providing a model policy that will include a sample timetable, but there is flexibility if you would like to leave it up to the state agency. I think we would like to have them, all of the goals accomplished in approximately 10 years or so. But there is room for flexibility there. You don't have to stick exactly to our time.
Great, thank you. And so another question we received is, how common is it that districts already conform to the points that you're lobbying for?
It's a good question. All of the points, not very common at all. Some of them, there are some states that have already committed, said we're not rolling back nutrition standards or whole grain standards. So everyone has kept the course on whole grains, but very less frequently are we seeing pushing forward on the sodium standards. Some districts are fairly innovative and have started eliminating artificial sweeteners. We haven't seen much movement on establishing added sugar standards. So there's a lot of work to be done for sure.
Great, and a bit of a follow-up to that, aside from arming parents with pitchforks and marching them to the school board meeting, what incentives are there for disinterested and or dismissive districts to adhere to these changes?
That's a good question. So we do have in our optional priorities, we would love to see an additional incentive for them, a financial incentive, and that could be a per meal increase in reimbursement for meals that meet these updated standards. I think that's priority number one. But, with that, we want to be able to work with them and provide them, increased technical assistance and support to make sure that their meals are healthy and appealing to kids. We want the kids to want to eat the meals. So I think that's incentive in itself, is kind of encouraging them to meet the demands of families and do what's best for the kids.
Great. And there's some interest in the amount and number of awards that would be available.
Sure, I can comment on that. So I believe we've put in our documents that we're offering awards of up to $75,000 each. And currently we have funding for about 4 to 5 awards in the school meals category in particular. We are looking to see, we know this is an area, in the current climate of increasing importance. So we would love to be able to offer more of that than that, but that's what we're looking at right now.
And another question in your wheelhouse, Noelle, can organizations apply under 2 different categories for grants?
Yes. And we do have some organizations considering that already. Our general advice for this is, if you're interested in 2 different campaigns, submit 2 different applications because in most cases the work would be pretty distinct. Additionally, if you're interested in the SNAP community engagement work, that is a separate application because the questions and information we're collecting is different from the policy work. But you could apply for a SNAP policy campaign and a school foods policy campaign. The Common Grant application doesn't allow you to work on 2 applications at once, but once you submit one and you go to submit another one, it would copy over all of the information and you would just need to change the relevant project details. And if you're thinking of, I think there's some circumstances where we are looking at states interested in an omnibus type of bill or something that would be a combined effort between the 2. I think if that was the case, probably best for you to shoot an email to talk about that with us and see how it might fit in with other work that we're doing.
Great, thank you. And Megan, this is in reference to your response just a few minutes ago. Where would the increased reimbursement come from?
Ideally, the state would kick in funding, but that would have to depend on the specifics of the campaign. But yeah, I think for
We lost you for a second there. Could you repeat the end?
Sorry about that. I was just saying the state budget would have to, they would have to carve out some money of the state budget to support that.
Great, thank you. So another question we've received is how many of the grant dollars can be used for lobbying?
Yeah, so this depends a little bit as well. The general guidance that I've given, I believe in the application text, is roughly 20% on average of our subgrant funds we have designated for lobbying activities. That varies on a grant by grant basis because we have some organizations that already have a lobbyist funded by another funding source or already have community engagement work funded by another funding source. So it will vary based on your needs, but that's the sort of general ballpark. We can't fund everybody if everyone asks for half of their budget for lobbying because we have our own organizational limits.
Great. And this is in reference to the requirement that organizations have a demonstrated track record of passing state or local policies and a clear strategy for success. So this group's concerned that they may not be eligible if they're not working directly with changing policy at a state level. They work with school districts or LEAs to influence policy change or coach them on how to work with their local school board for policy change. So would they fit this grant?
Do you have an answer for that, Megan?
I'm so sorry, I cut out a little bit. Can you repeat that, Katie?
Of course. So this group's concerned that they might not be eligible for the grant since they're not working directly with changing policy at the state level. They work more with school districts to influence policy change or coach them on how to work with their local school board for policy change. So would that qualify for this grant?
Yes, this is open to both state and local opportunities. It would still need to be, updated policy, but a local wellness policy or school board policy like that would definitely be eligible.
Great, thank you. And so another question we've received is, do we have any recommendations for the per meal, for what the per meal reimbursement should be?
So we're looking into that. We don't have that written in at the moment, but we're definitely looking into best practices for what that could look like. Apologies, I don't have a more concrete answer than that at the moment.
Great. And someone asked us to clarify the amount of grants that we were able to give out this cycle, and also if we would consider separate grants to several orgs working together in the same state.
Sure. It was the current amount that we have is about 4 or 5 grants on school food specifically. We would consider, we definitely want to encourage organizations to work together. I think our ideal scenario is that if you're thinking about a coalition, that one organization would apply to be the lead and then subgrant to other organizations that would also be collaborating on the campaign. We understand we might get separate applications from organizations that aren't already connected to each other in a state. And so it's possible that we would then want to make introductions and see how, if working together makes sense. So I think it can be somewhat of a case-by-case basis, but I think if you're already connected with other organizations, our preference would be to give out one grant for the state as opposed to 3 or 4 separate grants to each institution.
Great, thank you. And so another question we've received is, what is the ultimate goal and what would we consider to be a win at the end of the program?
Yeah, the ultimate goal is to influence federal policy with this work. I think we have an eye towards, child nutrition reauthorization with all this. I don't know, Colin, if you want to add anything to that, but a win would be, a policy passed in a state or locality that commits to these strong nutritional standards, and also so that we're influencing the federal legislators in those states and localities. But without, if a policy isn't passed, then we still want to see, ground softening happening and, some conversations that are starting and more people aware of these issues and interested in this type of work in the future.
Yeah, hi everybody. This is Colin with also with CSPI, and I'm happy to just add that we so as Megan said, a win at the state or local level would be that all the schools in that jurisdiction are meeting stronger nutrition standards, and then also as part of the other campaigns that folks can work on, universal meals is another top priority. As a way to influence national legislation. So if Congress takes up child nutrition reauthorization next year, we'd love for Congress to just do this so that every school in every state is going to meet the stronger nutrition standards that align with the dietary guidelines. So they're on track for safe levels of sodium, and they're addressing added sugars, and they're back to providing more whole grains to kids. They're doing it in a feasible way so that schools can actually meet it later on. That's more realistic. They don't have to meet it, tomorrow. And that's also feasible for the school food industry. And if we do it through CNR also, then the increased reimbursement that schools get for meeting the updated nutrition standards, they get that extra money for meeting. And it'd be great if there could be an increase in reimbursement, which you could only do at the federal level. So we want to, undo the damage that's been done from the rollbacks and actually strengthen them at the national level. We'd also love for CNR to make universal meals permanent. And so the more states that do it, the easier it makes the case that the feds can do it.
Great, thank you both. And that's all that we have for questions from the chat. Give folks a few more minutes if they have any more. So we just received another question. So how many applicants are we expecting that will apply for this grant?
We don't know. I think we've had a lot of interest. I don't know, Katie might have the exact numbers. I think we probably had over 50 interested participants sign up for this webinar. And we've been, our organizers have been working to connect with groups in states across the country. So we're hoping for a good turnout, and hopefully if we're not able to give application or give grants to obviously all of the organizations that will be applying, we hope to have additional funding in the future. So this is a good opportunity for us to start a discussion with groups for the future.
Yeah, and I can add to that. For this particular webinar, we've had over 100 people register for it. So that kind of gives folks an idea of the number of organizations that are interested. And with that, we have another question. Would CSPI be willing to pull in or develop a resource to add to the grant resources, recapping the ways awarded campaigns can influence federal advocacy?
Do we have that resources like to support what we're looking for on the federal advocacy side?
We don't at the moment. We have, I think, like a line or two in the campaign priorities document that says the examples that I gave on how, we would encourage grantees to work on CNR, but it is a good suggestion. I don't know, Colin, what do you think about adding a resource like that?
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. And I am also encouraging folks who want to do a state or local campaign to work with us in lobbying or advocating at the national level, because Congress may take up child nutrition reauthorization next year. So I think it'd be a good resource to give folks. And then I think folks who are working at the state or local level on school foods should also be working at the national level as well with the same asks. So, strengthening the nutrition standards and expanding access to free school meals.
And I think we've been expecting that groups would have that as part of their application, that you're willing to work at the national level and have resources to do that, either with a request for some lobbying funds to do that, or details of how you already have the lobbying resources available to do that.
Great, thank you. And we're left with no more questions in the chat, but we can give folks a few more seconds if they're typing something or need to think about something a bit more.
Megan or Colin, do you have any final thoughts or things you want to share before we close?
The only thing that I would add, we didn't really talk about in our campaign priorities document on the website. We do have some key priority states that are highlighted. Those are not, we're not only accepting applications in those places, but those are a higher priority than other places. So just keep that in mind if you're really interested in applying and you don't see your state listed. I still encourage you to apply.
I would just add, I personally think obviously this is a very exciting, it's a wonderful opportunity that to be able to work with all of you to pass state and local policies, and to get like the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act to the finish line in 2010. It required a village of 2/3 of the states having already passed competitive food laws to get soda out of schools. So to move in the right direction for schools, for healthier meals in the long term for kids, it will again take a village. And so not only, and these past 4 years, unfortunately, we've had to play defense. I think now is an opportunity, even with COVID and the economy, with more kids now relying on school meals, that state budgets are looking at how can they help these struggling families. And so we both can increase access and also make sure that meals are as nutritious as possible for kids. So, and that the more states that work on this will help us get to a national policy. So it'll be very exciting to work with all of you. So I look forward to seeing your applications.
Okay, no more questions came in to you, right, Katie?
Nope, I think we are finishing up here.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining today. As we said, these resources will all be posted and shared, and feel free to reach out to us with any questions as you're working on your application or considering applying.
We did get one quick question in the chat that I just want to address. They asked if it was only available to those priority states listed. And I think just to clarify that those are the priorities, but if you're really interested and you're not from one of those states, you should definitely still apply.
Yep, that's right. Okay, thanks everyone and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.